today, Discovery are honoured to co-host this webinar with the UCD Institute for Food and Health. And I have the pleasure of co-hosting today with Professor Dolores O'Riordan, who's the director of this institute. And we both have the pleasure of speaking to Zoe Kavanagh, who is the CEO of the National Dairy Council. And she will speak to us today about glass to grass goodness, Ireland's dairy opportunity. So Zoe, how are you today?
I'm great, and I'm delighted to join this session. It's a topic I feel very passionate about. I consider myself a dairy evangelist, so I'm looking forward to the next 10 minutes and then 20 minutes on this topic.
Super, Zoe. So maybe we'll just kick off by asking, where are you located, Zoe, and what's keeping you sane as you socially isolate?
Well, I speak to you all today from the National Dairy Council's offices. We're based here in Sandyford. It's a sector that has put the health of their employees at the top of the agenda and thankfully has managed to both cocoon, process and produce the dairy required to keep consumers healthy and well. So we've been very fortunate over the last 3 to 4 months to ensure business continuity in a safe environment.
Okay, so maybe you tell us a little bit about what you do in the National Dairy Council and what makes you so passionate about what you do.
Okay, well, the National Dairy Council is primarily a farmer-funded organisation whose remit is to promote the portfolio of dairy products on the domestic market, but also to uphold and develop the reputation of that sector, both domestically and internationally. And our belief is if the credentials of the domestic market are impeccable, then our export business can continue to thrive.
Okay, so we're very, both the UCD Discovery and the UCD Institute for Food and Health are very interdisciplinary institutes. So we're just wondering, how interdisciplinary is dairy farming?
Well, it might amuse people to hear me say, I think the dairy farming model we have in Ireland is about as interdisciplinary as you can get. And let me explain why I think that. Firstly, in Ireland, we're a grass-based system, which actually is our unique selling point. And off that grass-based system, if you manage the grassland well, you have a low input production system with the lowest carbon emissions in the Northern Hemisphere. So now I'm just bringing a grass-based system and climate change close together. Furthermore, off the grass-based system, the farmer manages that and his farming herd, the dairy herd, for nutrients. So he manages the grass inputs and the diet for fat and protein constituent outcomes, which links to the price he gets paid. And ultimately, the grass-based system presents the consumer with a highly nutritious product, which is unique use from cradle to grave. So that's how interdisciplinary this sector is and a dairy farmer is.
So you mentioned grass a lot and nutrition. So I'm just interested to understand, is that Ireland's competitive advantage when it comes to dairy?
It is because of all the production systems around the world, we are the most grass-based. New Zealand would probably come closest, but we are the most grass-based. And 95% of the cow's diet is grass or preserved grass. And then that diet is boosted with appropriate levels of concentrate. And the benefit of that comes at a number of levels. So from a taste and appearance point of view, consumers would witness that Irish butter, particularly in the form of Kerrygold and other great Irish brands, it's got a distinct yellow color to it compared to a grain-based produced butter product. And within that, you've got the conjugated lineated acids and that those CLAs, while we have yet to secure a health claim around it, you know, are seen to have positive health outcomes. So grass is good from a nutrition perspective, but also the most appropriate system for the herd, because the animal is now outdoors, living as close to, you know, we'd like to say that the Irish cow has the best lifestyle among its dairy peers in the world, because it's a very natural system. And I think as consumers look to be reassured around natural and sort of ethical food production, grass-based is the best you're going to get.
Yeah, and I suppose along those lines, so ethical, so sustainability. So just wanted to maybe veer slightly towards sustainability now, and just what does the Irish dairy industry need to do better in the future? And I suppose my question really is along the lines of incentivizing farmers to be more sustainable.
Yeah, so while we've got a great starting point, and I often would say to the farming community, we have a lot of credit in the bank because of the grass-based system and the lowest carbon emissions in the Northern Hemisphere. There's an awful lot of work to be done. So let's just straight away, look, we have a new government, we have a commitment to a climate action plan, and the dairy sector has to find a way of taking 5 million tons of carbon emissions out of the system between now and 2030. And the way that will be done is, if I'm to draw a parallel with, managing your garden, it's about soil, it's about water, it's about nutrient management, and it's grassland management. And just to illustrate that, if we can get our soil to as close to a pH of 6.3, then we're ensuring that we're getting maximum grass growth. Every 10 days extra of grass growth reduces the carbon emissions by 1.7%. And then, in terms of water, and ensuring that we use the 99% of rainfall productively. And then you get into grassland management and nutrient management, which is the area of fertilizer. And by way of example, Teagasc have identified 27 steps on farm to reduce the impact on climate, actually, while also becoming more profitable. Protected urea is a great example, and then targeted application of fertilizer rather than broad brush applications. So lots on the menu to choose from. And I think over the last 18 months, we're observing, the 18,000 dairy farmers accelerating their rate of adoption of these practices because they are so committed to handing their farming enterprises over to the next generation.
Okay, that's I'm sure there'll be lots of questions around that. So our listeners, please do remember to submit your questions via the chat function at the bottom of your screen. So I'd like to maybe talk a little bit more about nutrition. And you read a lot in the media about lactose intolerance. So just wondering if you can tell me more about this. I know that I even see lactose-free milk in the shops. So maybe you could tell me a little bit more about that.
Yeah, so when you hear lactose intolerance, what that means is we're looking at, consumers having the presence of the enzyme lactase to break down the dairy as it goes into the body and ensure that it works well within their system. In Ireland, we would typically observe a 4% level of lactose intolerance within the population. But that doesn't mean you have to exclude dairy from your diet. You could still have up to 12 grams a day of dairy in the diet without experiencing any discomfort. Although when you travel to other parts of the world, you'd have up to 65% of the population being lactose intolerant because they don't have that enzyme, they don't have that lactase enzyme. So the dairy sector here in Ireland has been very proactive in responding to that through product innovation. And as you said, you can take your lactose-free milk, but you can also consume dairy. You don't need to take it out of the diet. And it just so happens that the northern population have managed to develop this enzyme because dairy has been in the diet for hundreds of years. So we've managed to develop that. And that's how the dairy sector has worked around it.
Okay. And then just, I suppose in the last kind of 90 seconds of our chat, I want to maybe talk about the biggest challenges ahead for Irish dairy. And I suppose one specific question is around which has the bigger impact, COVID-19 or what's your opinion on that?
Well, my viewpoint is I think we have performed as a sector really well through the pandemic. What most people wouldn't realize is May represents our peak production month, and the sector, through keeping the employees safe, healthy and well, have managed to be able to go to work, collect that milk, process that milk. And I think now the remaining challenge is, having processed all this great product, we do have a channel called foodservice that completely collapsed through COVID, not just domestically, but internationally. So there's going to be recovery in that channel. And I think that's a short-term challenge, but it's one that can be managed. I think the bigger challenge actually is in our, closest trading partner in the UK, and Brexit, what it looks as if we're facing is a no trade deal Brexit. And that has massive implications for the agricultural sector, because so much of our dairy and beef goes to the UK, and with the no trade deal Brexit, that means then we have to absorb the tariffs. And that's going to be extremely challenging, and we'll have to find a way forward on that, because the tariffs are so significant they'd wipe out any margin that's there in the sector. So I think we've shown how agile we are through a pandemic. We are very resilient in terms of trade, and we will get through Brexit, and then we'll actually just have to stand tall and demonstrate absolute leadership when it comes to climate change, and get to 2030 and demonstrate we're the best small dairy producing nation in the world.
Okay, that's great, and that's perfect timing, Zoe. Thank you so much. It ended really well. So that's our 10 minutes of of questions, and so now we're going to open it up to the floor for Q&A. And I have the absolute pleasure of co-hosting this Q&A with Professor Dolores O'Riordan. So I'm going to kick off first, and then I'm going to hand over to Dolores. So I have a question actually, and it's a personal question for you, Zoe. It's to do with pasteurization of milk, and there's a real popularity now associated with unpasteurized milk, and I'm just wondering what your thoughts are around this.
Yeah, I'd have a very clear position on this. Pasteurization is there to keep the population safe, and food safety, is the entry point for all dialogue around food. And without it, you run the risk of the very old, the very young, or the very sick, being exposed to pathogens that they should never be exposed to. And I, like you, share, a love for, unpasteurized cheese. And I've been out to farms and I've had the milk direct from, the milk tank. And it is from an organoleptic point of view, it is a very, whole mouth flavor experience. Like, it's fantastic. But we are in the business of safe nutrition, and pasteurization from a population health point of view, I just unquestionably should be the way we run our sector.
Okay, great. Dolores, I'm going to hand over to you.
Thanks so much, Patricia, and thank you, Zoe, for very comprehensive and succinct answers there on a very complex issue. I can see that the questions are coming in live and fast here on the chat line, but if I could be selfish enough maybe to start with a question from my own science background. So I've been involved in dairy research for many, many decades, and I've seen the evidence around the health properties of milk. Yet you see within the public that the myths often dominate. So I just wanted to get your views as to how do we work further to have the consumer informed by the evidence that's there with regards to health properties of milk, rather than what we see, which is often information not based on evidence.
It's a really interesting topic, Dolores, because what we've observed up to COVID has been a scenario where we have a young questioning consumer who seeks their information from sources that are very much around image trumping science. And a lot of our work is in trying to put the facts and the science to that young questioning consumer in a relevant manner. And that's much harder than it sounds. However, when we have gone, what we've done is some research through the COVID months. And actually, we are observing a return to expertise. We could see that same young questioning consumer looking for expertise, particularly in the area of health and immunology. So we were suddenly seeing through Google search a desire to hear from the expert. And in fact, 40% of the under 35 in Ireland have upped their dairy intake through the COVID experience. So what does that tell us? I think that we, having experienced a pandemic, have a population now looking for facts, looking for evidence. I think, look who stood tall, even among our health authorities through this pandemic. The trust scores in turning to scientists and medics to hear the facts And I think that's resonated with those young consumers. And I think what dairy needs to do, and other food groups, is tell their own story, which is underpinned by a lot of research and a lot of science. Of course, we can get distracted with what I'll call the pretenders, the plant-based pretenders. And we just need to talk about what we stand for and talk about all the health benefits that we present. And a very recent report that I thought, reminds us of science was from the Food Safety Authority, talking about appropriate diets for the 1 to 5 year olds, very clearly pointing towards, the benefit of having dairy in the diet in those early years, and very clearly calling out how, the alternatives are nutritionally incomparable. So I think that we're kind of moving into a space maybe where food as medicine is being considered, and the science, the thirst for science and fact is being reconsidered. So I see an opportunity ahead, which I probably wouldn't have said to you 6 months ago.
That's very positive to hear. And so it does lead on nicely actually to the first question that's come in here, which is around the growth of the non-dairy alternatives and how do we best tackle that. And while I think you've dealt with a bit of it, you might just want to speak to those plant alternatives relative to
yeah.
both.
I think what's really interesting is in the early days of the plant alternatives, I think, again, that young questioning consumer in particular was very interested. We call them neophiles, the desire to try something new and different. Consumers have a choice to choose whatever they want. But I think where we've got to be very assertive is to ensure that when it comes to nutrition, that we're very clear as to what they are and what they're not. And we would know that in terms of complete nutrition, they are incomparable. And it is frustrating, I will say, on a commercial basis, to find these plant-based products masquerading at milk on shelf, double the price, quarter of the nutrition, and they're almost wearing the emperor's new clothes in terms of that piece of image trump science. So that's frustrating. But again, not to knock another category, because there's now a new consideration when you look at that category and say, well, gosh, is this more of a climate friendly solution? Is this planet proofed? And again, this is where we need to be very clear around the climate impact of these products, because when you compare from farm to glass, the carbon footprint, with almond tree in California to glass, it tells a very different story. So I think they will play a role in the mix. And I think our role is to ensure that we up the volume around what we are. And certainly on the nutritional comparisons, we're far superior. On the climate comparisons of our grass-based system, we have a great story to tell. But we can see there's a growing interest, and it reminds me of where protein was 5 years ago. So many food products put protein front of pack because that was the hook. Now we have plant-based or vegan front of pack because that's the hook. And I think we just need to be clear when it comes to nutrition, what's in there and what's bioavailable and what's not in there.
Okay, I think it's my turn to ask you. So lots of questions coming in, and please send them in. Keep sending them in. So here's one for you, Zoe, and it's along the lines of what you were just speaking about. But it's the vegan movement and the vegan movement affecting future dairy consumption.
Yeah, again, it's a disruptor, right? So when I sometimes try and pinch myself and remain objective. This is a disruptive play in the dairy sector, and I think originally it tried to disrupt in terms of the role of animal and animal source protein in the diet, and do we need animal protein on our plate, yes or no, and is the plant protein a substitute? Then it moved on to climate change, and you'd have some people suggest that if you looked at Ireland and turned our whole agricultural sector into producing legumes and pulses, that would be the way forward. There's been a lot of studies done on population health impact, and complete nutrition through different sources. And there's no doubt that everything, it's boring to say it, but everything in moderation, and certainly animal sourced protein in the diet, someone goes far to say gives you a survivor advantage. So my view is, in terms of breaking it down, the consumer has 21 formal eating occasions in the week. That's your breakfast, lunch, and dinner 7 days a week, and a further 21 snacking occasions in the week. If of those 42 occasions, you dabble and find yourself, having a vegan type snack, that doesn't mean that everything else is bad. And I'm all for choice. And I think within the composition of your 42 dining occasions within the week, everyone wants choice and everyone's food to be tasty and interesting. But I think the sweet spot for dairy is it's versatile, it's tasty. Our grass-based system is so natural, and it is ultimately your desert island food because it is packed with macro and micronutrients. So I would say, it fulfills so many of those meal occasions in a very complete and affordable way.
Okay. And just another question from me before I pass over to Dolores then. So do you think A2 milk has potential in Ireland, as it's doing so well in New Zealand and Australia?
Yeah, there's a big debate about this, the A1 versus A2 milk.
I actually don't know what it is, so maybe you can explain, sorry.
Oh, and I'm probably going to do a bad job on this, and I'm actually going to not attempt to explain it so clearly, but our view would be that huge marketing dollars have been put into carving out that position in New Zealand and Australia. And right now, do I see it as the next big thing for Irish dairy? No, I don't. And I think an awful lot of work has to be done to understand it better, which is why I'm being slow to go into too much detail on it, because I think it's an emerging space. I know from a breeding perspective, we would have the ability to examine it here in Ireland, but I don't think it's the game changer.
Okay, great. Dolores? Oh, is Dolores still there?
I think Dolores is on mute.
Dolores, I think you're on mute.
I'm muted by the host, so I have no control, but sorry for the delay there. So it's relating also to breeding in different animal species. The next question is, does your organisation or other organisations in the EU support sheep and goat's milk producers?
Interesting. So we represent just the bovine sector and focus on cow's milk. That's what we were set up to do. Obviously, we're aware of farmers who, particularly in the area of cheese, have thriving goat and sheep enterprises. Milk is obviously very niche, and I know different cultures have different views on it, but our primary focus is actually on cow's milk and cow's milk products.
Okay, and the next question is around the organic end of things, saying you can buy organic milk, but not organic butter or organic cheese.
Yeah, it's an interesting point, and maybe I think here in Ireland, organic is very niche within our production range, and I think perhaps because we're off a grass-based system, so many of our credentials are as aligned to what the consumer perceives organic to be. It's very much, as I say, a niche space, and I know there would be a concern, particularly off the way we do things here in Ireland, that suggesting organic is superior almost suggests that our mainstream sector has some shortcomings. And again, I'll come back to the grass-based system. It's done so well, it's become the proxy for choice for the consumer. So it's not an area we focus particularly on. I know other markets would, but again, they're off a different system. They're off a grain-based system. And I think organic throws up different opportunities then.
Great.
Patricia?
Yeah, so thanks, Dolores. So here's an interesting question for you, Zoe. What is your take on the rise of plant-based butters? can they really, or can these dairy-free spreads really be called butter? And is this confusing for the consumer?
Yeah, and I'd even stretch terms and protected dairy terms to milk as well. You know, it's in Europe, this is where I think regulation serves us well, you know, because the dairy terms are protected terms. And yet, you know, there have been attempts to sort of abuse those terms and stretch their meaning. And ultimately, our primary objective should be to ensure the consumer is never confused. And what we would feel is that, you know, the use of some of these terms, and we see it time and time again in meat in particular, and to a certain extent in dairy, you know, they take all the attributes of the animal protein product and apply it to plant-based. And usually that's trying to, you know, evoke the sense of taste and versatility and mouthfeel. An awful lot of this comes back to mouthfeel and, you know, the pleasurable food experience. And my view would be the consumer should never be misled. And if you talk to consumers, they are so confused by front of pack labeling and what they're masquerading to be. And certainly, you know, when it comes to dairy, it is extremely, it's almost impossible to replicate the attributes of animal dairy. You know, the plant in terms of taste, actual product behavior, particularly when you get into, you know, the interplay of the components in cookery and mixing with foods, it just does not perform anything like dairy, which is why our chefs, you know, just reach for our grass-based product and those grass-based fats all the time, because it is just a very, very pleasurable experience.
Okay, and I'll just ask, I suppose, one more question, then hand over to Dolores for the final question, and then we'll wrap up because we've got 4 minutes left. So here's one for you. A Teagasc report last year found that Irish dairy farms are producing up to 3 times more greenhouse gas and ammonia emissions than other farming sectors. And the listener wants to know what can be done about this.
Okay, so here, since 2015, when quota abolition took place, Ireland's output in terms of volume output doubled. So we are now producing 8 billion litres in Ireland. In terms of carbon emissions, our efficiency at the same time on a per litre basis decreased by 15%. So I think it's important. We've expanded, but we've become more efficient. But obviously in total emissions, we've absolutely increased. And we get into an interesting debate here. Because Ireland has the lowest carbon emissions in the Northern Hemisphere, if you were to design a world of food production, you'd put dairy in Ireland every day of the week. Because if we don't produce, and in the 8 billion litres, we're feeding 45 million people every year. So we have a huge export business. If you don't produce it in Ireland and argue that it should be produced elsewhere, it will have a much bigger impact in terms of greenhouse gas emissions, because we're the most efficient. So I guess the point here is, one, let's consider displacement, because it doesn't serve the global agenda well. And actually, when we come into climate change, this is where there's some contradictions, because what we might do nationally, if we don't think globally when it comes to food production, you actually could put you could task the wrong country with the wrong product. And what I'm saying is, if you were to design food production, you put dairy in Ireland every day of the week. But that's not to say, oh, we can expand and keep expanding and it doesn't matter. It does matter, which is back to my point around, we have 5 million tons of carbon to take out of the system between now and 2030. And we have great work done by Teagasc to show how you remove it and how you become more efficient. And I think there's 2 key considerations here. One is biogenic methane is different from fossil fuel emissions. And I think the system needs to understand that methane is different. It's a short-lived emission. It's 12 years in its life cycle. And secondly, something that hasn't happened in the accountancy rules of greenhouse gas emissions is Ireland's ability to absorb carbon through its hedgerows and its grassland. So something that hasn't been accounted for is actually the sequestration value of our pasture land. And I think what you're going to find as our expertise develops in this area, dairy farmers will become even more interdisciplinary because they're going to be carbon farmers. And I think that's what you're going to see Ireland as a model come 2030. You're going to have dairy farmers talking about how they're also carbon farmers. And you may find actually that rather than being net emitters, they're net absorbers. And I think that that's a very interesting space for Ireland to examine and understand clearly.
Okay. So Dolores, I'll hand it to you for the last question then. Okay,
Patricia, and thanks so much. So I think we could continue the topic that you've just ended on there for many a long time, particularly in light of Ireland developing its 2030 strategy at the moment and dealing with all of the challenges you've just spoken about. So moving to the final question from the audience here this evening, it's I suppose related to the promotion of dairy again, and the question is, could there be more done if you had agencies like the NDC, Board BIA, Department of Agriculture, Food and Marine and or NUA working more collaboratively in order to get the story and promotion of dairy out? So the person asking the question is saying they feel that there's an awful lot of airtime given to vegans and less good news stories about dairy.
Yeah. So first of all, I couldn't agree more. I think collaboration is vital, and not just in terms of ensuring consistency of message, but also efficiency of expenditure. Because, you know, I think in the sector, it's extremely challenged when it comes to marketing dollars, and we've got to make sure that the collective marketing dollars, you know, give the sector the biggest bang for this buck. And look, always the disruptor, the young pretender, the novel or the novel news will get a disproportionate amount of airtime. And I quite often, you know, I'm meeting farming families and processors, and they're deeply frustrated with the, you know, number of column inches or the amount of airtime given over to this disruptive force. So what's my tuppence worth on this? I think collaboration is essential. I think, though, investment behind the true story we have to tell, and that story is, it's not dairy, it's Irish dairy, and we have the credentials which many would crave in terms of this natural production system, highly nutritious, benefit for population health. There's a great story to be told, and it's true. It's not made up. This is true. So I think the authenticity and the benefit needs to be invested in. Sometimes people aren't excited in hearing sort of the old-fashioned story, but I think, you know, that's where we need to tell it and retell it again, but in a collaborative way, and ensure that the roles and the responsibilities are clear. You know, our remit is domestic first and foremost. And as I say, it's about telling the story of the benefit of the product portfolio in the diet, but also reassuring and standing tall around the production system, grass, animal care, family farmed, and highly sustainable.
That's fantastic. So I think it's such a salient point for Patricia and I as directors of research institutes, where you need a collaboration of the promoting agencies, but I think also, as you mentioned, the funders, you know, that we need funding in order to support this science-based evidence, and it does require collaboration across so many government departments. So hopefully with the new government we'll be seeing that cooperation in the future. So yeah, thank you very much. I know, Patricia, you're keen to wrap up there.
Yeah, so we've run out of time, so I just wanted to say thank you so much, everyone. A huge thanks to Zoe for an absolutely captivating discussion today. Thank you, Zoe.
Delighted, and thank you for engaging me in these discussions. They're fantastic.
It was fantastic, and you ended in such a salient point, because it's wonderful to collaborate, and I'm glad you fully agree with us, and that's why I'm delighted to thank also my co-host today, Professor Dolores O'Riordan from the UCD Institute for Food and Health. So thanks so much, Dolores.
Thank you all, and thanks again, Zoe. And
Okay, thank you.
Thank you, and don't forget that we run these weekly, so check out zoomforthought.ie or sign up at our mailing list at discovery@ucd.ie. Thank you, everyone.